Everybody, my name is YouJin Kim. Thanks for joining me today. The title of my talk is Engagement and Motivation in Task-Based Language Teaching, Bringing Research to the Classroom. Before I start my presentation today, I would like to express special thanks to Global English Teachers Association, which put this innovative online conference together, and especially to Dr. Jae-myung-gu. So throughout this talk, I'm going to talk about my recent research, but before I do that, I would like to introduce my research interest. So as a language teacher and researcher, I have been interested in second language acquisition and task-based language teaching and the interface between the two areas. So far, I have examined task-based language program development and some task design factors, task implementation factors, and more lately, teacher's role during students' task performance. And I've done these research projects with the aim of developing teacher training programs, connecting research and practice in classroom context, as well as materials design. And I've done this research not only with English as a target language, but Korean, French, as well as Spanish. So throughout this talk, I will present studies that focus on English as a foreign language learners, Korean as a foreign language learners, as well as Spanish as a foreign language learners. So goal of the presentation. So when I was putting this presentation together, the target audience in my mind were both students and novice researchers who are interested in task research and task-based instruction. The first goal was to introduce two important yet less researched constructs, task engagement and task motivation. So you will see that some of the research projects that I will present during my presentation, they were not originally designed for task engagement research. But surprisingly, although it is a really popular and interesting topic in task-based research, there has not been that many projects focusing on task engagement. So I wanted to revisit these studies from task engagement perspective. The second goal is to explore the relationship between task engagement and the quality of task outcomes. The third goal was to discuss how previous task research can inform how to encourage our students to be engaged with tasks and stay motivated during task. And lastly, to discuss future directions for task engagement and motivation research. So the current presentation consists of four parts. The first part, because TBLT research and instructed SLA research has a lot of overlap and they have been influencing to each other. So I'm going to briefly introduce these two research domains and address the relationship between the two. And second part, I will review task engagement and task motivation research. And then in part 3, I will discuss practical suggestions and I will end the presentation with future directions for further research. So let's begin with part 1, brief introduction to the field of instructed second language acquisition and TBLT and their relationships. So a lot of topics related to task research or instruction, these were motivated by either ISLA, Instructed Second Language Acquisition Research, or TBLT research. So ISLA focuses on how learning conditions can be manipulated to facilitate second language development. And TBLT is a contemporary teaching approach which uses tasks as a necessary and sufficient basis for syllabus design. So as you can imagine, the common ground between the two fields is evidence-based language learning through task performance. But the way that these two fields define task is, or the use task is a little bit different. So in the field of ISLA, task has been mainly used as a tool to elicit target language by students. So tasks like picture differences, picture descriptions, and opinion gaps are widely used. So they are not necessarily real-world tasks that students might do outside the classroom, but they have been very successful for eliciting target language. On the other hand, in the field of TBIT, the definition of task is really important. And if you ever read any book related to TBIT, it always starts with defining what tasks are. So the common definition of a task is meaning focused. It should have real world parallel, and it has clear non-linguistic outcome, tangible outcome that students actually see at the end of task performance. So tasks like email writing and reserving a hotel room are the really good example. And I'm going to share two task examples from TBLT perspective. So the first example is from the textbook that I wrote with other colleagues, Learning Korean Through Task. So in this task, students were asked to create product review video on their webpage. So it's very similar to YouTube. So you probably have seen many YouTube videos that people reviewed the product that they bought and share what's good and what's not good, what's satisfied, what's not satisfied, right? So basically this task asks a student to produce such task. And the right side, it's called language programs. So this is a collaborative speaking task, and two students have two different pieces of information about two language programs. So while comparing these two programs, they have to decide which program that they want to join during summer. So these two tasks fulfill the characteristics of task. One is individual task, and the other one is paired collaborative task. So let's move to part 2 on introduction to the two focal construct, task engagement and task motivation. So I'm going to spend my majority of time speaking task engagement and end with brief notes about how task motivation and task engagement are closely related. So let's start with task engagement. Engagement refers to a state of heightened attention and involvement in which participation is reflected not only in the cognitive dimension, but in social, behavior, and affective dimensions as well. And Philip, the Chestnut's work is really widely addressed here. And according to them, they really highlight multifaceted construct of task engagement, and they highlight the interdependence of these characteristics. In other words, cognitive, behavior, emotional, and social. So when we look at the origin of this engagement with language that was introduced by Sversberg in 2009. So according to her, engagement with language refers to cognitive and or affective and or social state and a process in which the learner is the agent and language is the object. So she presents 3 dimensions of engagement with language: cognitive, affective, and social. So from cognitive perspective, the questions like, does students seem to notice, reflect language interaction features? This would be cognitive engagement with language. And affective engagement would be, is the students eager to participate? So it talks about students' emotion. And social engagement would be how interactive, how supportive to each other. So far, I would say SLA researchers have done a great job with addressing cognitive engagement by analyzing language-related episode or pragmatic-related episode. So language-related episode refers to any segments of conversation in which language learners talk about the language they are producing, question their language use, or correct themselves or others. So this is the example from one of my studies. So is she wearing her shoes? 아닌데, 어가 들어가면 안 돼. So this episode itself kind of demonstrates how students are cognitively engaged with the language during task performance. And more recently, my colleague Naoko Taguchi and I proposed pragmatic related episode because language related episode does not really consider pragmatic aspects of language use. So in the field of pragmatics, social pragmatics and pragmalinguistics are really important concepts. So in order to cover these two concepts, we propose this. So the example 4 is from one of our papers. So in this Think Aloud protocol, students were doing a drama script writing task, and they have to decide what form of request headache they wanted to write in the drama script. In this case, the target interlocutor was teacher. So the students are thinking, 자율학습 시간에 가지러 집에 가도 되나 물어봐야지. Or may big request. It's because this was for the teacher. Is there any way that I could? Is there any way that I could possible homework? My homework. Can I go to my house? So you can see the students is really trying to decide which pragmalinguistic form request headed he wants to include in the drama script that he is working on. So previous researchers have argued that, okay, so language-related episode can address cognitive engagement, but the way that it is operationalized is not really addressing social and affective engagement. So in my 2016 article that I wrote with two other collaborators, so in this chapter, we attempted to address that question, how we can include or address three dimensions of engagement. So in this study, the context was Spanish as a foreign language class at a university. Both classes met 3 times. So we had face-to-face class and online class. So at that time, students were asked to perform tasks face-to-face, and then in online class, they were asked to perform a task using text chat. So nowadays, because of this global pandemic, a lot of schools use programs like Zoom or Micro Teams, so students can easily see their face to each other while performing the task. But when people conducted SCMC, synchronous computer-mediated communication, they often tend to focus on text chat only. Okay, so this was the case in this study as well. So participants include 40 learners. We had 20 face-to-face, 20 online students, and they completed dialogic story retelling. So they were given these scenarios and comic strip, and based on this, they had to retell the story. And in order to address both affective and social dimensions of engagement, we provided a survey and students answered the survey question. So very brief summary of the findings. Between face-to-face and SCMC, face-to-face actually promoted more higher level of cognitive engagement that we saw based on the reflection on targeted form, which was Spanish subjunctive in this class, in this study. And in terms of affective engagement and social engagement, while face-to-face students were able to perform this task with more positive energy, had fun, willing to engage, purposeful, enjoyable, SCMC students shared really negative opinion towards this experience, and they also shared this anxiousness during task performance. So this is a very meaningful quotes that we collected on the survey. So one student from SCMC wrote on the survey, "To be honest, I hated this task. I didn't really know the person I was chatting with, and I don't think he really cared about working with me. He just wanted to get the task done and didn't really talk to me at all. It was weird. We didn't even really take turns. I tried, but he just kept going. So finally, I just let him retell the story and mentally checked out. So in this online class, mainly students had asynchronous meetings and they just completed the homework, watched videos. So that was the platform of this online class. And of course, doing SMC with someone that they are not familiar with really resulted in negative attitude towards task performance in this case. So in a later paper, Philip and the Chesney proposed 4 dimensions of task engagement, which were based on Svalbard's engagement with language. Cognitive engagement, social engagement, emotional engagement, and one dimension that they added in their paper was behavior engagement. So behavior engagement is time on task or participation. So the way that we can operationalize this engagement is maybe word counts or turn counts or amount of language that students produced. So those are the operationalization of behavior engagement. But other engagement dimension like social and emotional, we really need learner internal verbal data or their survey data or interview data to identify their level of engagement from social engagement perspective and emotional engagement perspective. But this cognitive engagement was very much similar to what Svalbard suggested. So then from now on, I will present a couple of previous studies that I conducted. But as I mentioned, these studies were not conducted from task engagement perspective. But lately, I'm thinking a lot about task engagement and kind of wanted to reinterpret this data from this perspective. So the first sample study that I want to review is Kim and Kang, which was just published in Computers and Composition. So in this study, we were interested in collaborative digital multimodal composing, MMC task. So we had 60 high school students in this study, and basically what we are interested in is what do high school students focus on during planning time? What do they focus on during task performance? Number 3, what is the relationship between their interaction and the quality of the resulting MMC product? And number 4, how about their perception? So questions number 1 and 2 are related to behavior and cognitive engagement because since this was a collaborative task, they were asked to interact with their partner, and that's one of the indications of their task engagement, especially cognitively and behavior perspective. And the task prompt is like this. What will the future look like? Discuss both positive and negative sides of our technology-enhanced future society, particularly with AI. You may refer to the content from the movie iRobot, and we provided reflection survey, which asks how helpful was this task? What do you think about this task? So for those of you who are not familiar with multimodal composing task, I'm going to briefly talk about this task. So it is defined as activities that engage learners in the use of digital tools to construct text in multiple semiotic modes, including writing, image, and sound. So basically the final task outcome would be kind of video format, but learners had to use different semiotic modes to deliver the meaning. Okay, so I share short clip of a video that was collected for the study. Okay, so you can kind of see how the students used still images or moving images, music, movies, and text to deliver the meaning. Okay. So the procedure of this study was students watched the iRobot videos and movie during 3 sessions, and then they were provided with unstructured planning time, just a piece of paper. And days 5 and 6 in a computer lab, they created this video in pairs. And they shared the final task outcome with the class, and they completed the reflection survey, and they also did the traditional writing. So in this presentation, I'm going to highlight what they discussed during this planning time and during task performance time, and how that task engagement is associated with the score, multimodal composing task score, and then students' perception towards that task. So we use a holistic rubric to grade the multimodal composing task quality. So in terms of cognitive and behavior engagement during collaborative MMC task, we recorded students' interaction, transcribed the data, and identified the topic that they discussed during task performance. So after going through several rounds of coding scheme development, we came up with these categories: task management, content, information search, language use, and technical problems. So once we identify one MMC episode, we coded what's the coded for the topic of the episode. Okay. So this is a sample one MMC episode. How about writing 2 advantages on one slide and 2 disadvantages on another slide? I think we can write one thing for one slide each, one thing for each slide. Yeah, the sample video was like that. Okay, so students mainly use Korean, so I provide the translated version here. So this would be one MMC episode focusing on slide design or organization. So we identified this episode and then counted the number of episodes focusing on different topics. So we can operationalize behavior and cognitive engagement based on this episode. So this is just a descriptive statistics table, and I'm going to summarize the findings. So I know the numbers look really daunting, but let me just show you briefly how we can interpret this table. So in terms of content, as you can see, this column is planning time, MMC, task performance, and total. Okay, so these are the number of MMC episodes. So you can see that content-related episode was a lot more frequent than the other types of episodes. So among content-related episode, which was 41 MMC episode, the majority of episodes were related to storyline or image-related discussion. And students also produced many language-related episodes. And mainly they produced grammar related episodes. So you can see here 15 grammar related episodes out of total 26 episodes. We also counted number of turns per MMC episode. So this type of information can provide behavior task engagement while discussing this task performance. The result shows that there was no significant relationship between MMC score, which was based on the holistic scoring, and the number of MMC episode, which is related to behavior and cognitive engagement. And now let's take a look at student survey data, which is related to their emotional engagement. So we asked how helpful was this task for improving English skills? And the majority of them mentioned that it's helpful. And the reason that they provide it include it provides opportunity to use English autonomously. about 28 people mentioned this. It's interesting and it builds confidence. So I like this final quotes here. I felt like I was being thrown in the sea, although I do not know how to swim, but I could find a way to write in English as I was trying to work with the task. So as you can see here, many students really appreciated the opportunity that were given to them to make this creative video using English based on the movie that they watched. But we also look at some negative comments here, and people who did not find it helpful mentioned that it's not that different. So as you can see, although everybody was provided with exactly the same directions, some people approach task performance differently than others. So for these students, they didn't find it really different from traditional writing. And they also mentioned my partner did the majority of writing. So as you can see here, emotional engagement, and this part might be related to social engagement. And they felt that because of lack of collaboration, they did not find it helpful. And in terms of the perceptions of multimodal writing project, overall students found this project very interesting. And some of the reasons that they provide was related to the use of technology and more novelty effects. Because they were not, these are high school students, and they really like using different technology, new technology, and this project helped them to be exposed to use different technology in classroom, and they really enjoyed using the technology in English class. So to summarize, let's interpret this result from cognitive and behavior as well as emotional engagement perspective. So we didn't find any significant relationship between cognitive and behavior engagement and the quality of collaborative MMC task. And we think it's because it was the timed task, and students were asked to interact a lot and make this video collaboratively. But since it was time and they were doing unfamiliar collaborative tasks, spending a lot of time discussing and talking about how to make this task might not have contributed to better quality of task outcome. But also we have to remember we only looked at the frequency of MMC and the number of turns per MMC episode. So the quality of engagement was not really fully examined in this study. So more sophisticated qualitative analysis is really needed in this line of research. In terms of emotional engagement, in general, Korean high school students showed positive and more enthusiastic emotional engagement with the collaborative MMC task because they felt accomplished, they were satisfied with the opportunity that they were given with using English. But again, we have to be careful when we interpret this result because this was just one-time task implementation in their English class, and probably this result might be due to the novelty effects. So then we were wondering why there was no relationship between engagement, in other words, MMC episode, like discussion, and the quality of the task outcome. Because in SLA research, interaction is supposed to be facilitating the language development. So we kind of hypothesize, well, maybe more collaboration, more talking might lead to better quality, but that was not the case. So then we conducted a follow-up study and we manipulated planning condition. So we followed exactly the same research design, but compared people who had structured planning versus people who had unstructured planning condition, and wanted to kind of see how this planning condition influenced the relationship between MMC episode and the quality of MMC output. So as I mentioned, exactly the same design, but group A had guided, group B had unguided. So the result shows that this was the DMC or MMC episode, the same coding scheme. The results shows that in terms of cognitive and behavior engagement, guided condition, which was given more structured worksheet than unstructured group. So they produced significantly more DMC episode compared to unguided. So going back to this worksheet, the guided condition, they were provided with more structured space so that they can plan these different semiotic modes ahead of time with the meaning in mind, right? So during planning time, they were able to produce a lot more DMC episode, which indicates cognitive engagement with each topic. But when we look at the during task performance, the picture was opposite. Unguided condition produced significantly more DMC episode compared to guided condition during task performance. Okay, now let's take a look at the relationship between pre-task planning condition, task engagement, and DMC scores. As I mentioned earlier, we were interested in figuring out why there's no significant correlation between amount of cognitive and behavior engagement and the task output. So by including this planning condition, we found a significant interaction effects between planning condition and the amount of engagement. More specifically, the increased amount of cognitive engagement by the guided planning group predicted higher DMC task scores when compared to the unguided group. What does this mean? This means that students who are provided with more structured planning, when they produced higher number of DMC episodes, which is higher degree of cognitive or behavior engagement, they received higher score compared to unguided group who produced similar amount of DMC episode. So when they were provided with more structured instruction or guidance during planning time, their discussion or their collaboration during task performance seems to be more constructive in terms of creating higher quality of DMC output. So there was kind of informative research that we were happy to see in terms of the relationship between cognitive and behavior engagement and the task outcome. So now I'm going to present two constructs that I believe that can be important to promote the 4 dimensions of task engagement in low-level foreign language classroom, such as English classes in Korea or Korean or Spanish class in the United States. So the first topic is task repetition. I have done a lot of research on task repetition so far, and there have been like 3 different aspects of task repetition. 1, procedure repetition, exact task repetition, and content repetition. And the second topic is synchronous written corrected feedback. So this is different from other types of written corrected feedback because this is provided while students are still writing or performing tasks. So far, people have identified direct synchronous written corrected feedback, which means teacher actually provided the corrected form. On the other hand, indirect synchronous written corrected feedback is teacher maybe just identify where the error occurs, but do not say how to fix it. Okay? So now I'm going to present a couple of studies that I have conducted lately and discuss how these 2 instructional techniques can help students to be engaged with the task or engaged with the language. So these 3 studies were conducted in the same instructional context, which was task-based Korean language curriculum in the United States. So the first study, which examined the role of task repetition in writing quality and attention to form. So in this study, we compared exact task repetition and procedural task repetition. As I mentioned earlier, exact task repetition is repeating exactly the same task twice, three times, depending on the frequency. And on the other hand, the procedural repetition is you are providing students with a task which follows the same procedure with different contents. So in this study, we compared these two task repetition conditions and how the task repetition condition impact writing quality and attention to form. The second study explores the effects of task repetition and indirect synchronous written corrected feedback. So we wanted to look at how these two factors impact the quality of task outcome in terms of complexity, accuracy, and fluency, and learner perception. And finally, in sample study number 5, we compared the effects of direct and indirect synchronous written corrected feedback on students' uptake of written corrected feedback and learner perception. So as I mentioned, because of time, I will not provide a detailed description of these studies, but since all of the studies were conducted in the same instructional context, let me briefly talk about research context. So data were collected in second semester Korean language classroom in the United States. Everybody completed the first semester of Korean class at the same institution, and they major in various disciplines such as business, biology, and applied math. And we implemented a series of different writing tasks throughout the semester, and this was actually part of that Korean textbook project. So we collected the learner task performance data and analyzed it in order to understand the benefits of this task. This is just one task sample that we implemented. So this task asks students to write a postcard to Kwangsu, a friend whom they met during study abroad in Korea. So we also provide the task input that potentially elicit target features, such as 지 마세요 in Korean. Okay. So research design, because these studies were conducted during the regular course curriculum, they followed almost the exact same research design. And we were interested in these days 4 and 5 when students were conducting collaborative writing tasks. So this is just a lesson plan that we followed when they were conducting collaborative writing task. So we did during this 15-minute class time, students had grammar vocabulary review followed by their formal instruction they provided earlier, and we introduced the task. And students who watched the modeling video, they did a paired speaking to exchange information, and they did collaborative writing for 30 minutes, and teacher provided synchronous written corrective feedback, and they finished the reflection survey. So this is just the example of students writing, and this was pretty good considering the students completed the writing within 30 minutes, and they were only second semester students. And as I mentioned, direct synchronous written corrected feedback, teachers circle the error and provide corrected forms orally, and indirect synchronous written corrected feedback to circling the error. So one study, we compared these two conditions. And all 3 studies, we implemented the same survey to address students' emotion or affects during this task performance. So this survey addresses task difficulty, student satisfaction, enjoyment, or motivation, etc. So let me talk about the main findings of these 3 studies. So in terms of behavior engagement, when students were provided with tasks following exact task repetition framework, it promotes writing fluency development. So when they repeated the exact task twice, they produced more writing under the same amount of time. In terms of cognitive engagement, exact task repetition and direct and indirect synchronous written corrected feedback improved complexity and accuracy. And procedure task repetition elicited more language-related episodes because students were provided with the new content. They negotiated more in terms of new vocabulary or new grammar structure. And synchronous written corrected feedback raised learner attention to language during task performance. So while they are working together and teacher walk around and circle these errors, and that really help students to pay attention to this erroneous language form, and they were able to fix those errors, which was high uptake rate. In terms of emotional engagement, students found both indirect and direct synchronous written corrected feedback helpful. Actually, this was somewhat surprising because we were really concerned that these lower-level learners might get discouraged or irritated when teachers walk around and circle these errors when they are really trying to make sentence or write sentence based on their limited Korean ability. But some students even found that prefer indirect synchronous written corrected feedback, especially those who are more autonomous learners. So I found these quotes pretty encouraging and interesting in terms of how synchronous written corrected feedback can help students have a higher emotional engagement with the task performance. So one student said, like, when professors say I'm wrong, then I'm wrong. So I trust my teacher in my Korean class. I am very grateful for his help during task. Just marking them, not even correcting them is helpful. It helps us to figure out what's wrong with it. So obviously this comment was from indirect written, synchronous written corrected feedback condition. The last one was from indirect condition as well. If he just told us what's wrong with it, we just look at them. And okay, I think the process of figuring out what's wrong with them help us to learn and remember them better. So these students seems to be really autonomous learner, and he really enjoyed the process of figuring out how to fix the error after teacher circled the error. So now let's move to task motivation. So again, as I mentioned, I'm going to go over task motivation very briefly because the purpose of this part is based on Dornier's argument. There is very close connections between task engagement and task motivation. So according to him, the traditional concept of motivation is the combination of trait and state motivation, which are task independent and task dependent. So these are the factors that potentially affects task motivation. Learner-specific factors, learning situational factors, such as teacher, class size, or composition of learner group or pair. And task-related factor, of course, whether or not tasks are designed, considering students' needs or interest, or some other factors, timing. Did the teacher provide enough time to students? So there was kind of more traditional view of task motivation, but Dornier in his 2019 chapter, he discusses 4 motivation conglomerates in task-based research. Okay, so the first one is interest. So, according to him, interest is such a core part of motivation research or task motivation. So it integrates motivational, cognitive, and affective elements. And the second part is productive learner role can also contribute to task motivation. Whether or not students become a useful member of a task team or active member or perform necessary and complementary function, all of this experience can contribute to task motivation. Thirdly, he also talked about motivational flow, and the concept of flow has received increasing attention, particularly in the field of positive psychology. It's a state of intensive involvement in a task, a heightened level of motivated task engagement. So this part is very closely related to task engagement, right? So when students had fully blown flow during task performance, that's the indication of task motivation. So that help students to have a sense of control over the completion of task and have clarity about task goals, and students can have focused attention through this motivational flow. And of course, vision can contribute to task motivation. Recently, Dornier talks a lot about vision, like ideal self, imagine what they want to be in the future with the target language that they are studying. So if they have a clear vision, the self-image of being a successful L2 user, maybe performing tasks or staying motivated during task performance can be very helpful. But of course, all of these concepts can be really challenging when we apply this to task motivation research. So for instance, vision is such a huge word and concept. So applying the future vision to only like short-term 30-minute task performance might not be feasible. And he ends his article by saying it's important to look at task motivation from an engagement-specific perspective. So he also provides engagement definition, active participation, and involvement in certain behaviors. And I think Dornier, in his previous work, he always emphasized this action as a part of motivation stage. So looking at task motivation from this perspective allows the researchers to address both the motive and its manifestation in a united concept. In his term, when students are engaged, they are inevitably fueled by some motivation. But motivated learners are not always engaged with tasks because of some unexpected distractors like technology nowadays or working from home, right? So motivation is undoubtedly necessary for preparing the deal, but engagement is indispensable for sealing the deal. So as I mentioned, I didn't spend a lot of time discussing task motivation research. And actually, surprisingly, there has been just a few research focusing on this construct and actually measuring task motivation and examining the relations between the two, task motivation and task outcome or language learning. So we really need more research in this line of research domain. So we really need a lot more research focusing on this line of research. And he also presents aspects of tasks that are associated with the task engagement, task presentation, task goals, task content, task ownership and challenge skill balance, task structure, positive emotional tenor of task completion. So these are not new in a way that a lot of task-based research highlight the importance of presenting the clear goal based on learner needs. Task content should be something that students are interested in. Although it has a very clear real-world goal, if the content is boring or if the contents are not relevant to students' interest, they might not be engaged with task or stay motivated during task. So when we talk about L2 motivation research, obviously the recent development motivation research from dynamic system theory should be acknowledged. So according to Diane Larson Freeman, who has done a lot of work using this theory, so this theory started as a branch of theoretical mathematics. It studies systems or subsystems that change through forces that do not follow predictable patterns of development. So as many of you know, this dynamic complexity theory challenges the linear pattern of language development or any type of individual differences. So help us to get out of this state or trait concept of individual differences and looking at those constructs from more dynamic perspective. Because systems or subsystems are constantly in interaction with their environment and reorganize themselves as a result of these internal changes. And I really like how she introduced this theory using these two concepts. It's not complicated but complex. So complex systems are made up of many components which interact and give rise to patterns at another level of complexity. And these systems are open and dynamic. So when we think about task motivation, even within 30-minute task performance period, students can change the motivation level depending on task input, depending on their partners, participation or engagement, or everything can be changed, right? So that's why I started looking at this student's perception or task motivation from this dynamic complex theory perspective. And in one of my articles with co-authors, we designed a task-based syllabus for university English courses. We examined 27 students' evolving perceptions of task-based instruction over one semester. So we created this task-based syllabus and kept tracking students' motivation change or perception change. And we call these six systems as a subsystem of students' perception, and task motivation was one of them. And we interpreted students' perception from this dynamic complex theory perspective. So just a very simple summary of the finding. So as you can see, all of these subsystems, they fluctuate over time. This is throughout one semester. So they completed 12 tasks. So task 1, task 2, this is work-related unit, traveling-related unit, and event-related unit. So when we zoom in, enjoyment, task motivation, these two sub systems. So enjoyment, you can kind of see it steadily improve over time, over one semester. So we use the mean and max moving window to show at what point they show more dramatic change. And task motivation was interesting because it started low. So in terms of task motivation, we ask, would you like to do a similar task in the future after each task? And you probably noticed that the first task, T1, for each unit has always the lowest task motivation level out of the 4 tasks in the same unit. So we argued that in the paper, as students repeated the task, they feel more motivated, or that maybe it's because of their confidence, right? So it was interesting to see the data from the perspective. So as I mentioned, without conducting this longitudinal study over one semester, by implementing different types of tasks, different time with different foci, we would not have been able to see these changes or trends, right? So I think when we conduct a task motivation, it would be wise to conduct longitudinal study. It doesn't have to be one semester, but at least a systematic implementation of certain types of tasks using certain implementation factors. Okay. Okay, now let's move to part 3. So this is where I will address practical suggestions for ways to improve engagement and task motivation in classroom contexts. So I will present or share 4 suggestions, but these are all based on my recent teaching with my collaborators. The instructional context was high beginner, low intermediate Japanese university students who are enrolled in business English classes. So as you can assume, the goal of this class is to improve English proficiency in general and business English in particular. So since business English requires using language in socially appropriate manner, pragmatics was kind of a big part of this class. Number one, let's promote task engagement by providing carefully designed collaborative tasks. And I think we all know the importance of designing effective collaborative tasks, and that's just the core part of TBLT. And how do we do that? And we need to consider students' needs and interest and what they want to learn from the class that they can take away when they move to the real world. So the first example is email writing test that we designed for this group of students. So they were interested in finding a job at a big company where probably English speaking is required or English writing is required. And email writing is just a very basic required task at any workforce. So in this scenario, you and your partner work at Yahoo Japan. Currently, you and your partner are busy working on a project. Today, you and your partner missed an important meeting because of the following reasons. So they have to come up with their own reasons. Write an email to your boss to ask for meeting materials. So these learners are not familiar with English writing at all. And just asking them to write pragmatically appropriate email was really challenging. Okay, so that's why we chose email writing as one of the task genre. And the next example is collaborative customer service task scenario. So since nowadays any customer service interaction is done either on the phone or online chat, so we wanted to introduce this online chat platform to them. So again, everything was done using Google Doc collaboratively. So students A, students B had a different role. So A was customer, B was salesperson. So basically, students A tried to collect information from the salesperson, students B, regarding what types of tablet PC that he or she will buy for his or her brother. Again, discussing computer-related features in English is pretty common, and responding to customers' question is again pretty important pragmatic competence that they have to acquire. So we designed this online chat task. So these are just the two sample collaborative writing tasks that we implemented, and obviously designing this type of effective task is really important when you want to promote task engagement among your students. The second suggestion is let's promote various dimensions of task engagement by modeling collaborative task performance. So in some of my previous research, I argued for the importance of task modeling video, which can be played or provided during planning time. So task directions can be written clearly, but when students are not familiar with, let's say, technology platform or collaborative task performance, just by saying how to do it might not be enough. So I always encourage my students to create modeling video if they want to implement any type of new task in their classes. So now I'm going to share a sample task modeling video that I created with my collaborators. So in this video, you will see two students perform the email writing test that I introduced earlier. So during this video, these two students try to show how to complete this collaborative writing task collaboratively by using different multimodal communication platforms. Since they were in Zoom breakout rooms, do you see their faces? So they will also talk, use oral language to discuss language issues. Also using Google Doc, they can also do text chat. So you will see how they utilize the text chat function during the Google Doc interaction. And I also believe the importance of using the first language as a tool while doing collaborative writing. So they also showed how to use first language, which in this case, Japanese. so during this modeling video.
It's Jones.
Okay, I think that looks good. What would be a good reason for missing the meeting?
How about this? The project we are working together was due yesterday.
I think that's a good idea.
So now it's showing the text chat on Google Doc. And you will see how the first language was used. And they also provide comments on each other's writing, and sometimes using first language, which is Japanese. And also showing error correction on each other's writing together. Again, showing how students making comment to each other's writing, correcting spelling. And they are showing how to write the email together collaboratively. So sometimes when people are doing collaborative writing, they just divide up parts, right? Okay, so I write this part and I write that part. But in this case, we are really trying to show how to co-construct messages together. Okay, so that's the end of the modeling video. Okay, the third suggestion is let's promote task engagement through teacher synchronous corrected feedback. So when I reviewed a couple of Korean research, I mentioned synchronous written corrected feedback and the potential of synchronous written corrected feedback in task performance or the subsequent language learning. And I strongly believe that by providing synchronous corrected feedback, especially for low-level learners, as long as they are not distracted, as long as they are not discouraged, can be a really useful tool. So indirect synchronous written corrective feedback, it encourages students to pay attention to language while focusing on creating meaning either individually or in groups. And it facilitates helpful interaction during collaboration. So when two students or more than two students perform tasks together, sometimes they might not pay attention to certain language, which is, cognitive engagement, but by, noting where the error occurs, they can facilitate more interaction. Okay, so that's related to social engagement. And it also promotes students' feeling of purposeful engagement. So when teacher marked the error, they had to discuss and solve the problem together, so they feel more accomplished when they address those questions. So that's related to effective engagement. But we need to be careful because indirect synchronous written corrective feedback, as I mentioned, it can cause lowering of confidence compared to direct synchronous written corrective feedback, depending on your student's learning style. So as a teacher, this is something that you need to monitor as time goes. And nowadays, we use different technology platforms like Google Doc, Google Slides, and Microsoft Teams. So we can be really creative in terms of how to provide synchronous written corrective feedback. So we could provide oral and written feedback on students' writing of various genres very easily. So as you just saw in the modeling video, the students were performing tasks in breakout rooms, and teachers can also visit breakout rooms and point out a couple of errors or concerns, and then move around. And this can be done just using the Google Doc. Teachers can type the feedback and students can address it. So these various communication platforms can be very useful in instruction. So this is just a sample video screenshot of indirect written corrective feedback and students uptake. So this was the screenshot of that salesperson, the text chat task. So two students are writing this customer salesperson text chat. So how can I help you? I am looking for a tablet PC for my brother. Okay, so then the teacher provided correct this part, and then students A looking. So they were doing this task in a Zoom breakout room. So I just replaced their real face with the cartoons, and they can either orally discuss how to fix it, or just directly fix the error, or use the dialogue chat box to discuss the issue. So there are different channels to give feedback and address feedback as well, which is very beneficial. And the last suggestion is let's promote task engagement through task repetition. And this, I think task repetition can be very useful, especially when you teach pragmatics. So taking speech complaint as an example, as you can see here, teaching pragmatics or how to make complaints is not easy because there are different factors that students need to consider when making a decision, how to make complaints to different people. Social power, is it high, low, social distance between the interlocutor and the speaker, distant, close, or seriousness of situation, is it very serious or not serious? So based on these three dimensions, students need to decide whether or not they're gonna use more direct complaint or indirect complaints. So I just provide some examples, strategies here, like threat warning. If you're late again, I will make you wait for me for hours, or explicit complaint. And we also have indirect complaint, like no explicit blaming. I know you have a lot going on. So basically it's complaint, but indirect way of complaint, okay? And same, giving apologize to somebody can be also challenging, especially when you are dealing with the different level of social distancing or different level of seriousness. Okay, so they also need to understand the social pragmatics in order to decide what types of strategies would be appropriate in certain social contexts. And especially when you are teaching business English, this type of pragmatic competence is really important, right, for successful communication. So by using drama script writing task, so I have implemented procedural task repetition. So procedural task is constant, the same, but the content was different. So in this case, since we were interested in teaching how to make complaint or how to apologize, properly in a given social context, we provided different scenarios following the same procedure. So it follows the procedure task repetition condition. So the first task, Nobu and George have been roommates for the last 10 months. Although they agreed to clean the house together on Sundays, Nobu has never cleaned it. George is complaining about this to Nobu, and Nobu is apologizing to George. So in terms of power, it's the same power. Roommate, close friend. So you are making complaint to the person who has the same power, and apology, again, the same power. So the next task, Ms. Suzuki has purchased groceries from the same supermarket and used their delivery services over many years. Thus, customer staff members treat her like a VIP member. In many recent orders, Ms. Suzuki has experienced missing items. Ms. Suzuki is complaining about this to a customer service staff member, Andy, and Andy is apologizing to Ms. Suzuki. So in terms of power relations, it's different from the first example. So you are making complaint to somebody who has lower power, but maybe it's more serious problem. You are also trying to apologize to somebody who has a higher power. So again, the procedure of writing drama script is the same, but they really have to think about the content of this scenario and social context of this task. And the last task, which again follows the same procedure. So Harue has taken 3 classes with Professor Murphy and respects a lot as his professor. Professor Murphy has promised to return students' midterm papers with their feedback and comments in 1 week. However, Professor Murphy has not returned the papers for 1 month. Harue is complaining about this to Professor Murphy, and Professor Murphy is apologizing to Harue. For some of us, probably this is a pretty familiar situation. So in this case, again, the social context is very different from the others. You are making complaint to somebody who has higher power. Your professor, you are complaining to professor. An apology, professor is apologizing to students who has low power. So again, by repeating this type of similar procedure of task, but trying to decide what's the right pragmatic forms that they can include in each context is really important practice that they can do to improve their pragmatic competence. And putting this task repetition and synchronous written corrected feedback together in teaching pragmatic competence. So this is just a screenshot of students' interaction based on the last scenario that I just presented. So Harue, hi, Ms. Murphy. Murphy, hi, Harue, what happened? So originally students wrote, I want you to return the report I submitted to you. So it is very direct. So these students had no idea about how to be polite when he or she is complaining to someone who has higher power. So then by using synchronous written corrected feedback, the teacher mentioned social pragmatic related to information and then actually fix the error. So hopefully when the similar situation happened or in the real world task, students were able to use this type of new knowledge. Okay, now let's move to part 4, future directions of task engagement and motivation research. So as I mentioned, although these 2 constructs are very important and interesting, surprisingly, there has not been much research done focusing on these 2 constructs. So we need to carry out well-designed empirical research examining the interdependence among diverse dimensions of task engagement that was introduced during this talk: cognitive, emotional, behavior, and social. So I would argue that we can start with replication research. So over the last decades, researchers in the field of applied linguistics really call for replication study. So we have a lot of strong task-based research. So replicating this strong research design and interpret the data from task engagement perspective can be very helpful. And next, mixed method research is very much needed. So far, I showed some quantitative research findings, but without detailed qualitative data, it's very hard to understand students' emotional and social engagement. And from that dynamic complexity theory, longitudinal research is really important so that we can capture students' evolving task motivation, which can be influenced by many different factors. And without implementing a series of tasks, just by implementing one or two short tasks, this understanding task motivation will be very, very difficult. And then I would argue that we need a clear connection between these two constructs and different operationalizations in a systematic manner. So some more detailed research goals that I think it's important here, examining interdependence of different dimensions of engagement, as I mentioned, and exploring evolving task engagement and task motivation over time. And without longitudinal study, this cannot be done. And examining how to encourage students' engagement with tasks through task design and implementing research in classroom context. So in order to do that, we need tight researcher and teacher collaboration. And that's really important first step that researchers or teachers can start exploring. And investigating what aspects of L2 task motivation encourage students to be engaged with the task. Is it the vision that they have? Is it their interest that they have when performing the task? Or other factors that Dornier described in his chapter that I reviewed briefly earlier. And investigating both short-term and long-term language learning. So eventually our goal here is whether or not task motivation can be lead to learning. In terms of task design and implementation, I would like to argue that it's very important to expand target language use domain, especially reflecting on the current situation or real-world situation outside the classroom. So for instance, when this whole global pandemic happened, Foreign Language Journal published a special issue focusing on app-based learning or technology-mediated learning or online teaching. So some of the studies are listed here. So now in this fast changing digital world, things change all the time, frequently and rapidly. And as a task researcher, we need to really reflect on these changes and try to adapt these changes when we design tasks or implement tasks. So that's why we need to go beyond motor task. So far we have been very comfortable with implementing tasks just using simple paper-based task input and have students to write something or say something or interact using the task information. But in this digital world, different platforms, communication platforms like Skype, Zoom, Instagram, or YouTube, we need to go beyond this monomodal task format. Okay, in other words, multimodal task. And data triangulation from research method perspective is also highly important. So for behavior and cognitive engagement, task performance data is important, but in order to gain insights into students' emotion and affective engagement, learner internal introspective verbal report data is much needed. And their comments through surveys or interview data can also provide useful information about different dimensions of task engagement and motivation. And multimodal data, both verbal and non-verbal. So far, task research has focused on more verbal data, but nowadays gesture studies have received growing interest, and I think that's unexplored area in the field of task-based language teaching, especially when it comes to task motivation and task engagement. Non-verbal cues can be very insightful to understand the students' engagement. Okay, that's what I have prepared for this presentation. Thank you so much for your attention. I look forward to communicating with you via Q&A sessions. Please don't hesitate to share any comments or questions. I'll be happy to address them. Okay, thank you.